Chapter 1. Welcome to Paradise. I was born screaming in compartment 7G, block Tertius 47, just like 847 other babies that rotation. The medici said my lungs were strong, good for processing the recycled air that's been breathed by 10,000 others before it reaches your HAB unit. That's what passes for a blessing in the hive, being physiologically adapted to inhale other people's exhaled poison. My first memory isn't of my mother's face, but of the ceiling. A maze of pipes, cables, and ductwork exactly 2.3 meters above my crib. That's regulation height throughout the mid-hive residential sectors. Enough clearance for a standard human to stand upright. Not enough space to feel free. The Adaptus Administratum calculated the optimal psychological pressure point. Too low and productivity drops from claustrophobia. Too high and citizens start getting ideas above their station. The morning shift klaxon woke us at 500 every day without exception. 23 billion citizens in our sector alone, all stirring at the same moment, all shuffling to their assigned daily functions. The sound of that many footsteps creates a low rumble that never stops, the heartbeat of the hive. Sleep wasn't about rest, it was about mandatory unconsciousness to prevent overconsumption of breathable air during non-productive hours. My father worked the reclamation plant on level 45, processing organic waste into protein paste. Corpse starch, they called it, though mentioning what went into it was technically heretical under Local Ordinance 847C. Waste not the Emperor's bounty was painted in Gothic script above every feeding station. The irony wasn't lost on anyone with half a brain. The Emperor's bounty was literally the recycled remains of those who'd served him. Breakfast was always the same. A grey cube of compressed nutrients, exactly 347 calories, with a metallic aftertaste that suggested recycled metal shavings. The flavour was intentionally unpleasant. The ecclesiarchy taught that suffering purified the soul, and even meals should remind citizens of their unworthiness. Water came from the communal tap, warm and slightly acidic from its journey through the hive's ancient filtration systems. 300 people shared our water source. When someone died of contamination, their family received a citation for improper resource maintenance. My mother never spoke of what she did on level 46. Factory work, she'd say when pressed, but her hands were always stained with something that wasn't industrial lubricant. Years later, I learned she worked the organic recycling centers, the places where bodies went when families couldn't afford cremation permits. The stains were from handling corpses, sorting useful materials from waste. She'd come home every day smelling like death masked by industrial-grade disinfectant, a scent that seeped into everything we owned. School was held in compartment 7A, where 200 children aged 5 to 12 learned basic Gothic literacy and Imperial doctrine. Our instructor, Proctor Thane, had one eye and half a jaw from what he called disciplinary action during his own education. He taught us that knowledge was dangerous, that curiosity led to heresy, and that our purpose was simple: serve, work, die, feed the hive's endless hunger. The lesson that stuck most wasn't about the Emperor's glory, but about population mathematics. One citizen dies every 3.7 seconds in Hive Tertius, Thane would recite. One citizen is born every 2.1 seconds. The hive grows by 47,000 souls daily. Resources diminish by 0.3% annually. Calculate your worth. The calculation was simple. Individual human life had negative value. Every birth was a debt against future resources. Every death was a small mercy for those who remained. We were taught to see each other not as people, but as competing consumers of air, food, and space. Love was a luxury that led to unauthorized reproduction. Friendship meant sharing resources you couldn't afford to spare. Trust was a form of suicide. Recreational time was from 2100 to 2200 hours in communal space 7D. 50 families shared an area the size of a small chapel, with 3 broken Vox speakers that played Imperial hymns on endless loop. Children played Purge the Heretic, a game where they'd point at each other and shout accusations of thought crime. Adults gathered around the communal data slate, scrolling through the daily casualty reports, looking for names they recognized. Finding someone you knew in the death notices wasn't tragic. It was a form of entertainment, a reminder that you'd survived another day. The walls were covered with motivational murals, the Emperor's golden light shining down on grateful workers, space marines standing vigilant against unseen threats, tech priests blessing the sacred machines that kept us alive. But between the murals, you could see the truth. Rust stains, moisture damage, cracks that had been painted over so many times they looked like scars. The infrastructure was dying, and we were dying with it, but slowly enough that you didn't notice until it was too late. Waste disposal was a family affair. Every HAB unit received weekly collection tokens, 3 for solid waste, 2 for organic matter, 1 for liquid disposal. Exceed your allocation and face nutrient reduction penalties. The system encouraged hoarding waste until the smell became unbearable. Then desperate decisions about what could be flushed illegally versus what had to be processed officially. I watched my parents debate whether my sister's soiled clothing was worth a waste token, or if she should simply wear the filth until wash cycle allocation renewed. The night cycle brought different sounds, the hum of air recyclers working overtime, the distant crash of industrial machinery, screams from the upper levels that might have been nightmares or executions. Sleep came in shifts within our family unit. Someone always had to stay awake to guard our possessions from neighbors desperate enough to steal the unstealable. A spare clothing ration, a water purification tablet, an extra food cube saved from breakfast. This was normal. This was home. This was the life the Emperor provided for his faithful children in the 41st millennium, and I thought I was lucky to have it. Chapter 2. The First Crack. The first sign that paradise had flaws came during my 15th year, when the water began tasting different. Not just the usual metallic tang of recycled moisture, but something organic, something that made your throat close up if you drank too much too quickly. The change was subtle enough that most citizens adapted without complaint. The human body is remarkably efficient at accepting poison when the alternative is dehydration. My assignment came through the labor allocation Voxcaster at 0600 sharp. Citizen J. Voss, report to sanitation engineering, sublevel 43A, immediate deployment. No congratulations, no orientation period, just coordinates and a threat of penalty for tardiness. I was 16, possessed of a basic technical education, and had tested negative for obvious mutations during my last medical screening. That qualified me for infrastructure maintenance in the bowels of the Hive where more valuable citizens refused to work. Sublevel 43A existed in a twilight zone between the mid-Hive residential sectors and the true underhive. The air here moved differently, thicker, with currents that suggested vast spaces beyond the work corridors. My supervisor, Engineer Koras, had been augmented with basic Mechanicus implants, a Vox grill where his mouth used to be, a data port behind his left ear, and optical sensors that clicked when he focused on something important. Voss, his artificial voice crackled. Your primary function is waste flow monitoring. Secondary function is structural integrity reporting. Tertiary function is remaining alive long enough to be useful. Questions. The work area stretched beyond sight in both directions. A tunnel system carved from the Hive's bedrock, lined with pipes thick as HAB units and covered in a patina of industrial grime that suggested centuries of continuous operation. The main waste channel ran down the center, a river of liquid that moved with purpose towards some distant processing center. The smell was indescribable. Not just human waste, but industrial runoff, chemical byproducts, and something sweet that made you think of flowers until you realized it was decomposition. My colleagues were a collection of the failed and forgotten. Karis, whose left arm had been replaced with a crude mechanical substitute after an industrial accident. Dellen, who spoke in whispers because acid vapor had burned her vocal cords. Macro, who'd been assigned sanitation duty as punishment for questioning a Departamento Munitorum requisition order. We were the expendables, the citizens whose deaths would improve the Hive's resource allocation rather than diminish it. The daily routine was simple. Walk the tunnels, check pressure readings on the waste flow monitors, repair minor blockages, and report anything unusual through the Vox network. Unusual was defined as anything that might affect waste processing efficiency. Burst pipes, structural collapses, or the discovery of industrial accidents that hadn't been properly disposed of through official channels. 3 weeks into my assignment, I found the first body. She was lodged against a filtration grate about 2 kilometers down the main tunnel, pale and bloated from her journey through the waste system. That wasn't unusual. Citizens fell, jumped, or were pushed into waste channels with statistical regularity. What was unusual was her clothing. Clean synth fabric work overalls with Level 89, Administrative Sector, stenciled on the back. Administrative workers didn't work in areas where they could accidentally fall into waste systems. They didn't live in sectors where waste system access was possible without specific authorization. I reported the discovery through proper channels and waited for disposal instructions. Instead of the usual drag to processing chute order, I received a personal visit from Agencia Coras and 2 Departamento Munitorum officials whose uniforms were too clean for sub-level work. Citizen Voss, Corus's Vox grill buzzed. Describe exactly what you observed. I recited the facts: location, time of discovery, condition of the body, clothing details. The Munitorum officials exchanged glances that suggested communication beyond my clearance level. One made notes on a data slate. The other studied the body with the sort of professional interest that indicated this wasn't his first mysterious corpse. Your observation regarding clothing inconsistencies, the note-taker said, demonstrates commendable attention to detail. However, administrative workers occasionally receive assignments requiring movement between levels. Industrial accidents occur. The matter requires no further investigation. They removed the body and my work assignment continued normally. But 3 days later, I found another one. This time, a man in tech adept robes with augmetic implants that suggested high-level mechanicus training. His personal cogitator was still functional, displaying work orders for atmospheric processing, level 127, classification, sacred. Whatever he'd been working on involved the air supply for the upper spire levels where the nobility lived. I reported this discovery through the same channels and received the same response. Officials, questions, explanations that didn't quite explain anything, and the removal of evidence. But this time, Agencia Coras lingered after the Munitorum representatives left. Voss, he said, his optical sensors clicking as they focused on my face. Your pattern recognition subroutines are functioning above expected parameters. This is noted in your personnel file. Continue current assignments, report observations through standard channels, maintain operational security protocols. That night, during rest period, I performed my own investigation. The bodies weren't falling into the waste system from access points in their work areas. They were being dumped there after dying somewhere else. The administrative worker had fingernail scratches on her arms consistent with defensive wounds. The tech adept's augmetic implants showed signs of forced disconnection, the kind of damage that occurred when someone removed data storage units from a living subject. Someone was killing people who worked with sensitive information and disposing of their bodies in the waste system where accidents were expected and investigations were not. The pattern suggested either criminal activity or officially sanctioned elimination of security risks. In a hive city, the distinction was often meaningless. Over the following weeks, more bodies appeared. A scribe from the Administratum archives, a Vox operator from the Central Communications Hub, a medicae from the Noble Family Treatment Centers. All had access to information that could embarrass, incriminate, or inconvenience someone with enough power to arrange their deaths and disposal. All were being processed through my sector of the waste system like they were industrial byproducts. The implications were clear. Someone was sanitizing information by eliminating the people who possessed it. The waste system wasn't just processing sewage and industrial runoff. It was processing political problems, operational security breaches, and inconvenient witnesses. We weren't sanitation engineers. We were cleanup crew for a systematic murder operation, and I was starting to understand that discovering this pattern might qualify me for the same waste disposal treatment as the bodies I'd been finding. The paradise of the Hive City was built on a foundation of corpses, and I was standing in the drainage system that processed the evidence. Chapter 3. Down the Drain. The truth revealed itself in Sector 43 Delta during the graveyard shift. when the main waste processing systems cycled to minimum flow. I was performing routine maintenance on pressure valve 7743C when I heard voices echoing from the upper access tunnels, voices that should not have been there during non-operational hours. "Another batch from level 156, one voice said, distorted by the tunnel acoustics but clearly human. "Administrative staff who accessed the grain allocation reports. Standard processing," came the reply. "Strip the augmetics, harvest any useful organs, send the rest through the grinder. The reports will show industrial accident statistics increasing by acceptable parameters." I pressed myself against the tunnel wall, hoping the shadows and waste vapor would provide concealment. Through the maintenance grating above my position, I could see movement. Figures in dark synth leather work gear dragging something heavy across the walkway. The something had arms and legs that dangled with the distinctive limpness of recent death. "This one's still breathing," the first voice noted with clinical detachment. "Processing chambers don't require pre-sorted materials," the second voice replied. "The machinery is designed to handle organic matter in various states of operational capacity." They were talking about feeding living people into the industrial waste processors. The same machinery that converted organic waste into the protein paste distributed as emergency rations throughout the lower hive levels. The grey cubes I'd eaten every morning for 16 years weren't just made from the dead. They included people who'd been murdered for knowing too much about the systems that kept the hive functioning. I watched them drag the body toward processing station Delta 7, a massive facility I'd always been told was restricted to senior sanitation personnel. Through the observation window, I could see a complex array of grinding mechanisms, chemical treatment vats, and compression systems designed to reduce organic matter into its component useful materials. The operation was completely automated. Dump the raw materials into the input hopper, and processed nutrients emerged from the output chutes 12 hours later. The realization hit me with the force of a falling HAB block. The food shortage reports, the increased protein ration allocations, the sudden uptick in industrial accidents among administrative personnel. It was all connected. Someone had solved the hive's chronic food shortage by systematically murdering citizens who posed security risks and processing their bodies into nutrition supplements for the general population. Over the next several shifts, I began mapping the operation. The bodies I'd been finding were overflow, disposal system backups when the main processing centers reached capacity. The primary operation ran through a network of concealed chambers and automated systems that most sanitation workers never accessed. Bodies came down from the upper levels through dedicated transport tubes, disguised as waste disposal chutes. They were sorted by a combination of servitor units and human operators who showed no more emotion than factory workers processing raw materials. The scale was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested 200–300 bodies per day flowing through the Delta sector alone. Multiply that by the 17 processing sectors I could identify, and the daily death count reached into the thousands. The hive's population reports showed normal mortality statistics, but they were lies. Natural deaths, accidents, and executions were being supplemented by systematic assassination of anyone who might threaten the established order. I discovered the victim selection criteria by accessing discarded work orders from the processing stations. The targets weren't random. They were chosen based on access to sensitive information, tendency to ask inconvenient questions, or possession of skills that made them valuable enough to warrant elimination rather than simple reassignment. Scribes who'd seen classified documents, tech adepts who'd worked on restricted systems, medical personnel who'd treated high-ranking patients, even sanitation workers who'd discovered evidence of the operation. The organizational chart was impossible to determine from my position, but the scope suggested coordination at the highest levels of hive administration. Someone with authority over the Adeptus Administratum, the Departamento Munitorum, and the Ecclesiarchy was orchestrating mass murder as a solution to multiple administrative problems: food shortages, information security, and population control. My investigation was interrupted when Engenseer Chorus appeared in my work sector during what should have been his rest period. His optical sensors focused on me with unusual intensity, clicking rapidly as they adjusted focal length and spectral analysis parameters. "Citizen Voss," his Vox grill crackled. "Your work performance has been exemplary. Initiative demonstrated. Pattern recognition capabilities exceed baseline human parameters. Recommended for advancement opportunity." Advancement in sanitation engineering typically meant assignment to more dangerous work areas where accidents were more likely and supervision was less direct. It was a polite way of arranging someone's death while maintaining plausible deniability. My discovery of the murder operation had been noted, and I was being processed for elimination through standard channels. "Report to Processing Supervisor Magnus Delta Sector, 0800 tomorrow. Bring personal effects. Assignment duration, indefinite." That night, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. I was going to run, not just change work assignments or relocate to a different hab block, but actually attempt to leave the Hive entirely. The impossibility of the plan was matched only by the certainty that staying meant becoming raw material for the protein paste production line. The problem was logistics. Hive cities were designed to prevent unauthorized movement between levels. Transit checkpoints, citizen identification requirements, and automated security systems made it virtually impossible for someone of my clearance level to reach the Hive as external access points. The upper spires were defended like military installations. The lower reaches were controlled by criminal gangs who killed intruders on sight. The external walls were monitored by sensor networks that could detect a human heartbeat from kilometers away. But I had advantages that most escape attempts lacked: detailed knowledge of the waste processing infrastructure, access to restricted maintenance areas, an understanding of the industrial systems that most security protocols ignored. The same tunnels that processed human remains also connected to the Hive's external disposal systems, the massive discharge ports that expelled treated waste into the toxic environment beyond the city's protective barriers. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Follow the waste processing flow to its ultimate destination outside the Hive, then survive long enough in the wasteland to reach another population center. The probability of success was minimal, but it was better than the certainty of death that came with reporting to Processing Supervisor Magnus. I spent my last night in the Hab unit memorizing the waste flow schematics and calculating resource requirements for wasteland survival. Water purification tablets, compressed rations, rad counter, respirator, and protective clothing, none of which I possessed or could acquire through legal channels. I would have to steal survival equipment from the very organization that wanted me dead, then use their own waste disposal system as an escape route. As I prepared to leave everything I'd ever known, one thought dominated my mind. If I succeeded in escaping the Hive, would I find freedom in the wasteland, or would I discover that the entire world was just a larger version of the same systematic horror I was fleeing? The murder operation required infrastructure and organization that suggested coordination beyond a single Hive city. If the protein paste production system was standard throughout Imperial space, then billions of citizens were unknowingly consuming the remains of assassination victims while their murderers solved administrative problems through industrial cannibalism. The morning shift klaxon sounded at 0500, just as it had every day of my life. But instead of reporting to my assigned workstation, I gathered the few possessions that might aid my survival and set out through the maintenance tunnels toward an uncertain future beyond the city's walls. Behind me, 200 billion souls continued their daily routines, unaware that their breakfast might be their neighbor. Their government was systematically murdering them for administrative convenience, and their entire civilization was built on a foundation of processed human remains. Paradise had revealed its true nature, and I was no longer willing to call it home. Chapter 4. The Grinder. The maintenance tunnel to processing station Delta 7 stretched for 3 kilometers through the Hive's structural support framework, a claustrophobic passage barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. The air here moved differently, pulled toward the processing center by massive atmospheric recyclers that needed constant airflow to prevent the accumulation of toxic gases from the organic matter reduction process. Every breath carried the sweet stench of decomposition masked by industrial-grade chemical neutralizers. I had stolen the equipment I needed during the previous night's shift: a respirator from the emergency supply locker, water purification tablets from the medical station, and a handheld rad counter that was supposed to be checked out through proper channels. The theft would be discovered within hours of the next inventory check, marking me as not just a security risk, but an active criminal deserving immediate processing through the Delta 7 facility. The tunnel's wall panels showed the strain of decades supporting the weight of the processing center above. Stress fractures leaked condensation that ran down the metal surfaces in patterns that looked like tears. The structural supports groaned constantly, under loads they were never designed to bear. A reminder that the Hive City was a slowly collapsing monument to humanity's determination to survive in places where survival was impossible. 2 kilometers into my journey, I encountered the first checkpoint, an automated security scanner designed to identify authorized personnel through biometric analysis. The scanner was built into the tunnel wall, impossible to bypass or avoid, with optical sensors that activated the moment a human heat signature entered its detection range. Citizen identification required, the machine spirit announced in High Gothic. Present authorization for Delta Sector access, or return to assigned work area immediately. I had prepared for this moment by studying the maintenance records for the entire security system. Every automated checkpoint in the Hive required periodic calibration and cleaning to function properly. The scanner's optical sensors were particularly vulnerable to contamination from the waste vapor that permeated the tunnel environment. A simple mixture of industrial lubricant and organic waste applied to the sensor lenses during a previous maintenance shift would cause temporary blindness lasting approximately 47 minutes. Citizen identification processing, the scanner announced, its optical sensors struggling to penetrate the film of waste matter I had applied 2 hours earlier. Technical malfunction detected. Maintenance request logged. Proceed with caution. The processing center's exterior was a monument to Imperial engineering efficiency. A massive reinforced concrete structure with no windows, minimal access points and exhaust vents that discharge processed air through filters designed to prevent contamination of the upper hive levels. The building hummed with the constant operation of industrial machinery, grinding mechanisms, chemical treatment systems, compression units, and packaging equipment that operated 24 hours a day without interruption. I accessed the facility through Maintenance Portal C7, using stolen authorization codes I had memorized from discarded work orders. The portal led to a service corridor that ran parallel to the main processing floor, separated by reinforced transparent steel windows that allowed maintenance personnel to observe operations without interfering with production efficiency. What I saw through those windows violated every assumption I had held about the nature of civilization, human dignity, and the limits of administrative pragmatism. The processing floor was divided into distinct operational zones, each handling a different stage of organic matter reduction. Zone Alpha received raw materials through automated delivery systems, bodies on conveyor mechanisms that moved with the steady rhythm of factory assembly lines. The bodies were naked, having been stripped of clothing, augmetic implants, and any materials that might interfere with the grinding process. Zone Beta sorted the raw materials by type and condition. Servitor units, their human components long since replaced by mechanical alternatives, used scanning equipment to identify usable organs, valuable augmetics, and other materials worth salvaging before final processing. A team of human technicians supervised the operation, making notes on data slates as they catalogued the recovered materials for separate processing streams. Zone Gamma housed the primary reduction machinery, massive grinding mechanisms that could process an entire human body in less than 3 minutes. The sound was indescribable, a combination of mechanical grinding, liquid processing, and the wet collapse of organic structure under industrial pressure. The machines operated with such efficiency that input materials entered the system as recognizable human forms and emerged as homogenized organic paste ready for chemical treatment. Zone Delta applied the chemical processing that converted raw organic paste into stable protein compounds. Industrial-sized vats contained solutions that broke down the remaining cellular structure, neutralized potentially harmful bacteria, and added preservatives that would extend shelf life during distribution. The chemical smell was overwhelming even through the sealed observation windows. A mixture of cleaning agents, organic acids, and synthetic flavoring compounds. Zone Echo handled final packaging. The organic paste was compressed into standardized cubes, wrapped in synthetic preservation material, and labeled with nutrition information that bore no relationship to the actual contents. The labels identified the product as Imperial Guard Emergency Rations, or Hive Worker Protein Supplement, complete with fictitious ingredient lists and Imperial Aquila approval seals. The entire operation was overseen by Processing Supervisor Magnus, a man whose augmetic enhancements had progressed far beyond basic functionality into the realm of aesthetic modification. His left arm had been replaced with a multi-tool industrial appendage. His skull showed the distinctive scarring patterns of cranial implants, and his eyes had been replaced with optical sensors that could analyze the protein content of processed organic matter through spectral analysis. Production efficiency, 127% of target allocation, he announced to his subordinates through a Vox grill that had replaced his original throat. Quality control parameters within acceptable variance. Increase input flow by 15% to meet tomorrow's distribution requirements. I watched the operation for 2 hours, documenting every aspect of the systematic murder and processing operation through written notes that I planned to smuggle out of the hive as evidence. The scale was beyond anything I had imagined. Conservative estimates suggested that Delta 7 alone was processing over 400 human beings per day, converting their remains into approximately 2,800 kilograms of protein paste that would be distributed throughout the lower hive as supplemental nutrition. The victim profile was more specific than I had originally understood. Most of the bodies showed signs of malnutrition, suggesting they had been selected from the poorest population segments where disappearances were less likely to be investigated. Others bore the scarring patterns associated with specific occupations: dock workers who had handled classified cargo, communications technicians who had processed sensitive transmissions, medical personnel who had treated high-ranking patients. But the most disturbing discovery was the presence of children in the processing stream. Bodies that couldn't have been older than 10 or 12 years, processed with the same mechanical efficiency as adult victims. The children bore no signs of malnutrition or occupational scarring. They had been selected for reasons that had nothing to do with security concerns or administrative convenience. They were simply excess population, converted into food for the remaining citizens through the most efficient method available. As I prepared to leave the observation area and continue toward the external waste disposal systems, I noticed movement in the processing center's administrative section. Supervisor Magnus was receiving visitors, 3 figures in the black uniforms of the Adeptus Arbites, the Emperor's law enforcement organization responsible for maintaining order within the Hive City. The conversation was too distant to overhear, but their body language suggested routine coordination rather than investigation. One of the Arbites handed Magnus a data slate that he reviewed and approved with a brief nod. Another presented a list of some kind, probably target selections for the next processing cycle. The third observed the factory floor with the professional interest of someone evaluating operational efficiency. The realization struck me with devastating clarity. The systematic murder operation was a criminal conspiracy operating outside Imperial law. It was an official administrative solution to multiple policy problems, coordinated between the Hive's civil government, law enforcement agencies, and industrial infrastructure. The Adeptus Arbites were investigating the murders. They were facilitating them as part of their mandate to maintain civil order through any means necessary. Every level of the Hive's governmental structure was complicit in mass murder disguised as industrial food production. The citizens weren't victims of criminal activity. They were raw materials being processed by their own government as a solution to chronic resource shortages and security concerns. I had stumbled onto a systematic horror that revealed the true nature of Imperial civilization. Human life had no intrinsic value beyond its utility as an administrative resource. Citizens who became inconvenient were processed into nutrients for the remaining population. Problems were solved through the application of industrial efficiency to human extermination. And I was witnessing the operation from a position that made me the next logical target for processing. My knowledge of the system, combined with my obvious inability to accept it as normal administrative procedure, marked me for elimination through the same mechanisms I had been studying. The external waste disposal systems were only 3 kilometers away, but they might as well have been on another world. Between my current position and freedom lay the most sophisticated murder operation in Imperial space, supervised by law enforcement personnel who viewed human beings as manufacturing inputs operated by technicians who processed children with the same mechanical precision they applied to industrial waste. The paradise of the Hive City wasn't just built on systematic horror. It was systematic horror refined through thousands of years of administrative efficiency into the perfect mechanism for converting human suffering into continued survival for the remaining population. An escape was beginning to seem not just impossible, but pointless, because there was nowhere in the Imperium where I could run that wouldn't be connected to the same fundamental system of industrialized cannibalism that I was trying to flee. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The moment that shattered my remaining faith in the possibility of escape came when I discovered that the external waste disposal system I had planned to use as an escape route was itself part of the murder operation. What I had believed were standard industrial discharge ports were actually feeding processed human remains to the surrounding wasteland populations. Mutant communities that survived by consuming the hive's organic waste without understanding its true composition. The revelation came through a discarded shipping manifest I found in the processing center's administrative waste stream. The document detailed distribution arrangements for Type 7 organic nutrients to 17 external settlements, with delivery schedules that corresponded exactly to the processing cycles I had been observing. The external communities weren't just consuming processed human remains, they were dependent on them for survival, creating a network of unwitting cannibalism that extended far beyond the Hive City's walls. My escape route would have led me directly into communities that survived by eating the processed corpses of murder victims, managed by the same administrative systems I was trying to flee. There was nowhere to run, because the entire regional ecosystem was built on systematic murder disguised as waste management and food distribution. I spent the next 4 hours hidden in Maintenance Tunnel C-17, reviewing everything I had discovered and trying to identify any possibility of meaningful resistance. The scope of the operation suggested coordination at levels far above local Hive administration. The shipping manifests referenced distribution networks that spanned multiple star systems, indicating that the systematic conversion of inconvenient citizens into food supplies was standard Imperial policy rather than local corruption. The psychological impact was devastating. Every assumption I had held about the nature of Imperial civilization collapsed under the weight of evidence that human life was valued primarily as a renewable resource to be harvested when administrative efficiency required it. The citizens of the Hive weren't being protected by their government. They were being managed like livestock, fed and housed until their utility as living beings was exceeded by their value as processed nutrients. But something changed in me during those hours of despair. Instead of accepting defeat and waiting for inevitable processing, I began planning something that had never occurred to me before. Not escape, but sabotage. If I couldn't flee the system, perhaps I could damage it enough to disrupt the operation and give other potential victims time to understand what was happening to them. The processing center's vulnerability lay in its dependence on automated systems. The grinding mechanisms, chemical treatment vats, and packaging equipment operated according to programmed parameters that assumed consistent input materials and controlled environmental conditions. Introducing variables outside those parameters could cause cascading system failures that would shut down production for days or weeks while repairs were completed. I had access to maintenance areas that contained emergency shutdown systems, chemical neutralization supplies, and industrial cleaning agents that could be repurposed as sabotage tools. My knowledge of the waste processing infrastructure gave me advantages that most potential saboteurs would lack. Understanding of which systems were most vulnerable, where safety backups could be disabled, and how to cause maximum damage while avoiding immediate detection. The plan I developed was comprehensive and irreversible. Phase 1 would involve introducing industrial solvents into the chemical treatment vats, causing reactions that would contaminate the entire next production cycle and trigger automatic quality control shutdowns. Phase 2 would disable the primary grinding mechanisms by jamming their input systems with maintenance materials that were too hard for the machinery to process. Phase 3 would involve activating the emergency chemical neutralization systems throughout the facility, creating atmospheric conditions that would require full evacuation and decontamination before operations could resume. The sabotage would shut down Delta 7 for at least 2 weeks, preventing the processing of approximately 5,600 human beings, while creating evidence of the murder operation that would be difficult for administrators to suppress. Maintenance personnel, chemical disposal teams, and repair technicians would discover human remains in industrial machinery, raising questions that couldn't be answered without admitting the true nature of the facility's operations. But sabotage meant abandoning any possibility of escape. The security response to industrial terrorism would be immediate and overwhelming. I would be identified as the perpetrator within hours, hunted through the maintenance tunnels by Adeptus Arbeits kill teams, and eventually captured or killed. There would be no survival, no freedom, no opportunity to warn other potential victims about the systematic horror they were living within. The choice was clear: die attempting to escape into a world that was fundamentally the same horror I was fleeing, or die attempting to damage the system enough to give others a chance to understand their situation before they were processed into protein paste. I chose sabotage. The first phase began at 0347 hours, when I accessed Chemical Storage Unit Delta 12 and began transferring industrial solvents into portable containers. The storage area was protected by basic security measures: locked doors, automated inventory tracking, and atmospheric monitors designed to detect dangerous chemical concentrations. But the security was designed to prevent theft and accidental exposure, not sabotage by someone with legitimate maintenance access and detailed knowledge of the safety systems. Moving through the maintenance corridors with 20 liters of industrial solvent felt like carrying my own death sentence. The chemical mixture was designed to break down organic compounds at the molecular level. Exposure to human skin would cause immediate tissue dissolution. Inhalation would destroy lung tissue within minutes, and accidental spillage would create atmospheric conditions that would kill anyone in the immediate area. But it would also render the chemical treatment vats completely unusable, contaminating any organic matter introduced into the system and triggering every safety protocol in the facility. The chemical treatment area operated with minimal human supervision during night shifts. 2 technicians monitored automated systems from a control booth separated from the processing floor by reinforced transparasteel barriers. The vats themselves were accessible through maintenance catwalks that allowed cleaning and calibration without exposing personnel to the chemical processes below. I approached Vat Theta 7 through the primary maintenance catwalk, moving carefully to avoid detection by the security sensors that tracked movement in restricted areas. The vat contained approximately 10,000 liters of chemical solution designed to break down organic matter into stable protein compounds. Introducing industrial solvents would create a chemical reaction that would produce toxic gases, destroy the vat's internal components, and contaminate the entire production line with materials that would be immediately detectable by quality control systems. Pouring the solvents into the treatment vat felt like watching the end of the world in slow motion. The chemical reaction began immediately, a violent bubbling as incompatible compounds destroyed each other, releasing vapors that would have killed me instantly if not for the respirator I had stolen from emergency supplies. The vat's internal monitoring systems began registering chemical compositions outside acceptable parameters, triggering automated safety responses throughout the facility. Phase 2 required accessing the primary grinding mechanisms in processing zone gamma. These machines were the heart of the operation. Massive industrial systems capable of reducing human bodies to organic paste in minutes. They operated with such precision that jamming them required materials harder than bone, more resistant to pressure than human tissue, and large enough to cause mechanical failure rather than simple processing delays. I had prepared by collecting maintenance materials from throughout the tunnel system: metal pipe sections, industrial fasteners, ceramic insulation components, and pieces of machinery too damaged for repair but too valuable for disposal. The collection represented years of accumulated maintenance waste, materials that would destroy the grinding mechanisms while appearing to be the result of improper disposal rather than deliberate sabotage. The grinding chamber was accessible through Emergency Maintenance Portal Gamma 3, designed to allow rapid access during mechanical failures or safety emergencies. The portal opened directly onto the machine's input mechanism, a conveyor system that delivered organic materials to the grinding chambers, where massive rotating blades reduced them to homogenized paste. Dumping the maintenance materials into the input system created a cascade of mechanical failures that exceeded the machine's safety parameters. Metal components jammed the rotating blades, ceramic materials created grinding resistance beyond acceptable tolerances, and the accumulated debris triggered automatic shutdown systems designed to prevent equipment damage. The sound of the machinery destroying itself was audible throughout the processing center, grinding, tearing, crashing as industrial precision met materials it was never designed to process. Phase 3 was the most dangerous, activating the emergency chemical neutralization systems throughout the entire facility. These systems were designed to respond to catastrophic chemical accidents by flooding the processing areas with neutralizing agents that would render dangerous compounds inert. Activating them during normal operations would contaminate every surface in the facility, destroy any organic materials in the processing stream, and create atmospheric conditions that would require full evacuation and extensive decontamination. The activation controls were located in Emergency Response Center Delta Prime, a hardened facility designed to coordinate disaster response during industrial accidents. Accessing the center required bypassing security measures that were specifically designed to prevent unauthorized activation of emergency systems, biometric locks, encrypted authorization codes, and automated defense systems that would identify and eliminate intruders. But I had advantages that normal intruders lacked: detailed knowledge of the maintenance access routes, stolen authorization codes from discarded work orders, and understanding of the emergency system's operational parameters. More importantly, I had nothing to lose. Capture meant processing through the same systems I was sabotaging, so the risk of discovery was irrelevant compared to the potential impact of successful disruption. The emergency activation sequence required 3 separate authorization inputs within a 30-second window. I had memorized the codes from maintenance documentation and practiced the input sequence during my preparation. When I initiated the emergency neutralization protocol, every chemical treatment system in the facility began flooding with neutralizing compounds that would render them inoperable for weeks while contamination was cleared and equipment was replaced. The result was immediate and overwhelming. Klaxons throughout the facility, automated announcements of chemical emergency and mandatory evacuation, the sound of massive industrial systems shutting down as safety protocols overrode production requirements. In less than 20 minutes, I had transformed Delta 7 from an efficient murder operation into a contaminated industrial disaster that would require extensive investigation and repair before it could resume processing human beings into food supplies. But success came with the certainty of death. Security forces were already responding to the industrial emergency, sealing access routes and initiating search protocols for the saboteur responsible for the disaster. I had perhaps 30 minutes before they traced the sabotage to my location, and no possibility of escape through systems that were now flooded with neutralization chemicals or blocked by emergency response teams. I used those 30 minutes to complete one final task: creating a record of everything I had discovered. Using a data slate from the Emergency Response Center, I documented the murder operation, the processing procedures, the distribution networks, and the administrative coordination that made systematic cannibalism possible. The record would probably be destroyed after my capture, but there was a possibility, however remote, that someone would find it and understand what was happening to the citizens of the Hive city. As I finished writing, I could hear the security teams approaching through the maintenance corridors, their equipment clattering as they moved in formation toward my position. The hunt was ending, but the sabotage had succeeded beyond my expectations. Delta 7 would remain offline for weeks. Thousands of potential victims would live longer than they otherwise would have, and evidence of the murder operation would be impossible to completely suppress. I had chosen to die fighting the system rather than feeding it, and that choice felt like the first free decision I had made in my entire life. Chapter 6. After the Fall. The security teams found me in the Emergency Response Center Delta Prime exactly 37 minutes after I activated the chemical neutralization protocols. 3 Adeptus Arbites in full tactical gear, armed with shock weapons designed to subdue rather than kill. They wanted me alive for interrogation about the sabotage operation and assessment of how much I knew about the facility's true purpose. Citizen Voss, the lead Arbites announced through his helmet Vox system, you are charged with industrial terrorism, destruction of Imperial property, and interference with essential food production. Submit to custody or face immediate pacification. I had expected execution on site, but their restraint suggested that the sabotage had created problems beyond simple equipment damage. The chemical contamination had been more extensive than I had hoped, affecting not just Delta 7, but connected processing facilities throughout the sector. The neutralization cascade had spread through the waste processing network, shutting down operations across multiple levels and creating evidence of the murder operation that couldn't be easily explained or concealed. The interrogation took place in Detention Facility Gamma 17, a specialized installation designed for processing security threats before they were eliminated through official channels. The facility's interview rooms were equipped with medical monitoring equipment, chemical enhancement systems for improving subject cooperation, and recording devices that could document confessions for administrative use. My interrogator was Arbitrator Thane, a career law enforcement officer whose augmetic enhancements included neural interface ports for accessing classified information and chemical analysis systems for detecting deception during questioning. His approach was methodical and professional. He wasn't interested in punishment or moral judgment, only in determining the extent of my knowledge and identifying other potential security risks. Citizen Voss, he began, your sabotage operation demonstrates technical knowledge beyond your authorized clearance level. Explain how you acquired information about Delta 7's operational parameters. I told him everything. The bodies I had found in the waste system, my investigation of the processing center, the shipping manifests that revealed the distribution network, my realization that the entire operation was coordinated at the highest levels of Imperial administration. His expression never changed as I described systematic murder disguised as food production, industrial cannibalism managed through standard administrative procedures, and the elimination of inconvenient citizens through processing into protein paste. Your observations are accurate, he acknowledged when I finished. Delta 7 and similar facilities throughout the Imperium serve essential functions in maintaining civil order and resource allocation efficiency. Population management requires systematic approaches to dealing with excess citizens, security risks, and administrative problems. The protein reclamation process converts potential threats into useful resources while maintaining social stability. The casual acknowledgement was more disturbing than denial would have been. He wasn't trying to convince me that I had misunderstood what I had discovered. He was explaining administrative policy as if systematic murder was a routine aspect of Imperial governance that I should have understood and accepted without question. The sabotage you committed has disrupted essential services for 2.7 million citizens in the affected sector, he continued. Protein production shortfalls will require emergency resource allocation from other facilities, creating cascading inefficiencies throughout the regional food distribution network. Your actions have caused more suffering than the processing operations you attempted to disrupt. His logic was impeccable within the framework of Imperial administration. Saving the lives of 600 people scheduled for processing had created food shortages that would cause malnutrition and death among tens of thousands of citizens who depended on the processed protein supplements. My sabotage had traded certain death for a few against probable death for many, making it a net loss in terms of citizen welfare. But the interrogation revealed something unexpected. The scope of disruption had exceeded administrative expectations. The chemical cascade hadn't just affected Delta 7, it had contaminated waste processing systems throughout the sector, creating evidence of the murder operation that was being discovered by maintenance personnel, medical investigators, and chemical disposal teams. Bodies that should have been processed into protein paste were instead being found in industrial machinery, raising questions that couldn't be answered without admitting the true nature of the food production system. Contamination assessment indicates 47 separate facilities have been compromised, arbitrator Thane noted, reviewing data on his portable cogitator. Evidence recovery teams have documented 1,247 human remains in various stages of processing. Cover story development is ongoing, but the scale of exposure exceeds standard containment protocols. The sabotage had succeeded beyond anything I had imagined. Instead of disrupting a single processing facility, the chemical cascade had revealed the murder operation throughout the sector, creating a crisis that would require weeks to resolve and cover stories that might not be believable to citizens who discovered human remains in their food production systems. Standard procedure would involve immediate processing of security risks through available facilities, Thane continued. However, current operational capacity is insufficient to handle normal processing loads plus security threat elimination. Alternative arrangements must be considered. Alternative arrangements meant keeping me alive longer than originally planned while the administration dealt with the crisis I had created. The irony wasn't lost on me. The murder system was so disrupted that they couldn't efficiently murder me, forcing them to use resources keeping me alive that would normally be allocated to processing other inconvenient citizens. Over the following days, I was held in detention while reports filtered in about the expanding investigation. Chemical contamination had been discovered in 17 processing facilities. Maintenance teams were finding human remains in industrial machinery throughout the waste management system. Medical personnel were reporting unusual contamination in protein supplement supplies that suggested organic matter outside standard parameters. The administrative response was massive and coordinated. Deployment of specialized cleaning teams to remove evidence, development of cover stories to explain the contamination as industrial accidents, and systematic reassignment of personnel who had discovered evidence of the murder operation. But the scope of exposure was creating problems that couldn't be solved through standard information control procedures. Citizens were beginning to ask questions about the unusual industrial activity, the increased security presence, and the temporary reduction in protein supplement availability. Some were making connections between the contamination reports and the composition of their food supplies. Others were noting the correlation between disappearances in their HAB blocks and fluctuations in protein supplement allocation. The interrogation sessions continued for 6 days as arbitrator Thane attempted to assess whether I had coordinated with other potential saboteurs or if my actions represented an isolated security breach. His questions revealed the administration's primary concern: not the moral implications of systematic murder, but the operational challenges of maintaining the program while controlling information exposure. "Citizen Voss," he asked during our final session, "do you understand that your actions have jeopardized the survival of 200 billion Imperial citizens who depend on efficient resource allocation to maintain life support in this hive city?" I understood his logic perfectly. The systematic murder and processing of inconvenient citizens was presented as essential infrastructure, necessary for maintaining resource balance in an environment where natural resources couldn't support the population. Disrupting the murder operation meant condemning thousands to starvation while saving hundreds from processing. A mathematical calculation that favored continued operation of the system I had sabotaged. But I also understood something he did not. The citizens of the Hive City deserved to know they were eating processed human remains, and that their government was systematically murdering them to solve administrative problems. Even if that knowledge would cause panic, social collapse, and mass starvation, they deserved the opportunity to make informed decisions about their survival, rather than being managed like livestock by administrators who viewed them as renewable resources. The protein reclamation program represents the pinnacle of Imperial efficiency, Thane concluded. Converting security threats and excess population into essential nutrients maintains social stability while optimizing resource utilization. Your sabotage represents rejection of fundamental Imperial values: order, efficiency, and acceptance of necessary sacrifice for the greater good. He was right about Imperial values, and that was the most damning revelation of all. The systematic murder operation wasn't corruption or criminal activity. It was the logical expression of Imperial civilization's core principles. Citizens existed to serve the state. Individual lives had value only in terms of their utility to the collective, and administrative efficiency justified any action that preserved the larger system. The sabotage had revealed not just a local horror, but the fundamental nature of the Imperium itself. A civilization that had solved the problems of overpopulation, resource scarcity, and social disorder through industrialized cannibalism, managed by bureaucrats who viewed human beings as manufacturing inputs. On the 7th day, Arbitrator Thane informed me that alternative arrangements had been finalized. Instead of immediate processing, I would be transferred to a different facility for specialized administrative resolution. The euphemism was meaningless. It still meant death, just through different procedures that accommodated the current operational disruptions. But as guards prepared me for transfer, I could see signs that the sabotage was continuing to create problems beyond administrative control. Security alerts were increasing, industrial accidents were being reported throughout the sector, and emergency response teams were being deployed to facilities that should have been operating normally. The cascade effect was spreading beyond the original sabotage zone, creating systemic failures that suggested the murder operation was more fragile than its administrators had believed. Disrupting one facility had revealed vulnerabilities throughout the network, and the evidence exposure was generating additional security risks as more personnel discovered the true nature of their work assignments. I had expected to die quickly and quietly, processed through the same system I had damaged. Instead, I was becoming a symbol of resistance to a horror that most citizens didn't know they were living within. And my survival, however temporary, was proof that the systematic murder operation could be disrupted by individuals willing to sacrifice themselves to damage it. The transfer would probably end with my death, but the sabotage had succeeded in ways that exceeded my original goals. The murder system was damaged, evidence was spreading beyond administrative control, and other citizens were beginning to understand the true nature of their situation. That knowledge might not save anyone, but it was better than ignorance, and it was the closest thing to victory that was possible within a civilization built on systematic horror. Chapter 7. The New Normal. The transfer never came. Instead, 3 weeks after my arrest, Arbitrator Thane returned to my detention cell with a proposal that demonstrated just how extensively the sabotage had disrupted the murder operation throughout the sector. Citizen Voss, he announced, administrative review has determined that your technical knowledge and understanding of waste processing infrastructure makes you valuable for damage assessment and system restoration. Alternative arrangements have been approved. Alternative arrangements meant conscription into the cleanup operation, using my knowledge of the processing systems to help repair the damage I had caused, while simultaneously gathering intelligence about other potential security risks. It was elegant from an administrative perspective. Instead of wasting resources executing me, they would exploit my expertise, while keeping me under constant surveillance to prevent additional sabotage attempts. The work assignment was both punishment and opportunity. I would be part of the technical team responsible for restoring operational capacity to the contaminated processing facilities, giving me access to detailed information about the scope of the murder operation while working under conditions that made escape or additional sabotage virtually impossible. My first assignment was Delta 7 itself, the facility I had sabotaged. 3 weeks of chemical contamination had rendered it uninhabitable for normal operations, requiring specialized decontamination procedures and complete equipment replacement before processing could resume. The cleanup would take months and cost resources that could have processed thousands of additional citizens through other facilities. The facility was staffed by a combination of penal servitors, criminals who had been converted into semi-mechanical workers, and conscripted technical personnel like myself who possessed specialized knowledge but couldn't be trusted with normal work assignments. We worked under the supervision of Mechanicus tech adepts who treated the restoration project as an engineering challenge rather than a moral concern. Tech adept Corvin, the project supervisor, had been augmented to the point where his human components were minimal. Most of his body had been replaced with mechanical alternatives optimized for technical work in hazardous environments. His approach to the restoration was purely functional. He wanted to understand exactly how the sabotage had been accomplished, so similar attacks could be prevented in future facilities. "Citizen Voss," he announced through his Vox grill, "your sabotage demonstrated sophisticated understanding of chemical processing vulnerabilities. Explain the precise methodology you employed to maximize contamination cascade effects." Working with him gave me access to information about the murder operation that I never could have obtained through infiltration or investigation. The scope was staggering. 847 processing facilities throughout the Hive city, with a combined daily capacity of 23,000 human beings. The protein paste production network supplied supplemental nutrition to 89% of the Hive's population, making systematic cannibalism the foundation of the food distribution system. But the sabotage had revealed critical vulnerabilities in the operation. The facilities were interconnected through waste processing networks that allowed contamination to spread between sites, creating cascade failures that could shut down the entire system. Security protocols were designed to prevent external attacks, not sabotage by personnel with legitimate access to restricted areas. Most importantly, the murder operation depended on maintaining the illusion that processed nutrients were produced from standard industrial inputs. Exposure of human remains in the processing stream created crisis situations that required massive resource allocation to manage. Contamination spread analysis indicates systemic design flaws, tech adept Corvin noted during a technical briefing. Interconnected processing networks create vulnerability to coordinated attacks. Recommended modifications include isolation protocols and enhanced security screening for technical personnel. The restoration work gave me opportunities to assess the long-term impact of the sabotage. The chemical cascade had shut down 31 facilities for extended periods, reducing protein paste production by 18% sector-wide. The protein shortage had forced administrators to implement emergency rationing, reducing daily food allocations for 47 million citizens. Malnutrition rates were increasing, but so were questions about the composition of food supplies and the reasons for the production shortfalls. Citizens were beginning to notice patterns that suggested systematic problems beyond simple industrial accidents. The simultaneous contamination of multiple facilities, the discovery of human remains in processing equipment, the correlation between disappearances and fluctuations in food supplies. Individually explicable events that collectively suggested something more disturbing than random equipment failures. More importantly, personnel throughout the waste processing system were being exposed to evidence they couldn't ignore. Maintenance workers were finding bodies in industrial machinery. Chemical disposal teams were encountering contamination that could only have come from human tissue processing. Medical personnel were analyzing protein supplement samples that contained organic matter outside standard parameters. The administrative response was comprehensive but resource-intensive. Reassignment of personnel who had discovered evidence, development of cover stories to explain contamination as industrial accidents, and implementation of enhanced security protocols to prevent future sabotage. But each response created new problems that required additional resources and generated more opportunities for information exposure. Security assessment indicates 12,347 personnel have been exposed to classified operational information, tech adept Corvin reported during a weekly briefing. Standard protocol would involve elimination of security risks through processing channels. Current operational capacity insufficient for elimination requirements without further disrupting production schedules. The murder system was caught in a feedback loop. Sabotage had created evidence exposure that required elimination of witnesses, but the same sabotage had reduced the system's capacity to efficiently eliminate security risks, creating more opportunities for evidence exposure. The administration was being forced to choose between operational efficiency and information security, and neither choice could fully resolve the crisis. My work assignment included interaction with other conscripted technical personnel, giving me contact with citizens who had made similar discoveries about the true nature of Imperial administration. We were all security risks being exploited for our technical knowledge, while being kept under surveillance to prevent coordinated resistance activities. Mira Kellyan had been a chemical engineer in the Upper Hive until she discovered that industrial waste processing included human remains. Her attempts to report the discovery through proper channels had resulted in her reassignment to decontamination duties and classification as a potential security threat. Like me, she had chosen conscription over immediate processing, trading temporary survival for cooperation with the system we both found morally repugnant. "The scope is beyond anything I imagined," she told me during a rest period. "Chemical analysis of processed materials indicates systematic organic matter recycling throughout the entire hive. We're not dealing with isolated facilities. This is fundamental infrastructure that supports the entire population." Jorik Voss had been a maintenance supervisor until he discovered bodies being disposed of through waste processing channels. His investigation had revealed the connection between political disappearances and protein supplement production, leading to his arrest and conscription for technical duties. His knowledge of the maintenance infrastructure made him valuable for restoration work, while his discoveries made him too dangerous for normal work assignments. "Resistance is pointless," he concluded after sharing his story. "The operation is too large, too integrated into essential systems, too necessary for population survival. Even if we could shut it down permanently, the result would be mass starvation that would kill more people than the processing operation eliminates." His logic was sound but incomplete. The murder operation wasn't just about resource allocation, it was about control. Citizens who knew they were eating processed human remains and that their government was systematically murdering them for administrative convenience would make different decisions about their survival than citizens who believed they were being protected and provided for by benevolent authorities. The restoration work was progressing efficiently, but it was also creating new opportunities for information exposure. Technical personnel throughout the system were learning about the scope and methodology of the murder operation while being expected to repair and improve it. Each new worker exposed to classified information represented a potential security risk that would eventually require elimination through the same systems they were helping to restore. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. We were being forced to repair the machinery that would eventually process us into protein paste, while our technical knowledge made us increasingly valuable for restoration work and increasingly dangerous as potential witnesses to systematic horror. But something unexpected was happening as the cleanup progressed. The combination of personnel reassignments, security investigations, and industrial disruptions was creating communication opportunities that normally wouldn't exist. Technical workers from different facilities were sharing information about their discoveries, creating a network of citizens who understood the true nature of Imperial administration and were beginning to coordinate their survival strategies. The resistance wasn't organized or militant, it was informational. Citizens who knew about the murder operation were finding subtle ways to warn others, sharing survival strategies, and creating informal networks that could identify potential targets for processing before they disappeared. It wasn't enough to stop the systematic horror, but it was enough to give some potential victims opportunities to understand their situation and make informed decisions about their survival. 6 months into the restoration project, I was reassigned to Delta 12, a facility that had been upgraded with enhanced security measures designed to prevent sabotage attempts. My role was quality assessment, using my knowledge of vulnerable systems to identify weaknesses in the new security protocols and recommend improvements. The work gave me access to the complete technical specifications for the upgraded murder operation, improved isolation between facilities to prevent contamination cascades, enhanced security screening for technical personnel, and automated monitoring systems designed to detect sabotage attempts before they could cause significant damage. But it also revealed something more important. The systematic horror I had discovered was expanding. New facilities were being constructed throughout the sector, increasing processing capacity to handle projected increases in security threats and excess population. The murder operation wasn't a temporary solution to resource shortages. It was permanent infrastructure designed to manage human beings as renewable resources for an indefinite period. The Hive City wasn't just built on systematic horror, it was evolving into more efficient, systematic horror. refined through experience and improved through technical innovation. My sabotage had caused temporary disruption, but the long-term effect was to make the murder operation more resilient and harder to damage through individual action. The new normal was systematic cannibalism, managed through administrative procedures that were becoming more sophisticated, more comprehensive, and more deeply integrated into the essential systems that kept 200 billion citizens alive. And I was helping to build it. As months passed, the informal network of citizens who understood the true nature of their situation began developing more sophisticated communication methods and survival strategies. What had begun as casual conversations during work breaks evolved into a complex information sharing system that operated within the constraints of constant surveillance. Mira had discovered that chemical analysis equipment could be calibrated to detect human-derived proteins in processed food supplies, allowing citizens to identify which rations contained human remains. She developed testing procedures that could be disguised as routine quality control while providing information about the scope of cannibalistic food distribution. Protein analysis of standard rations indicates human tissue content varying between 23% and 78% depending on processing facility and distribution schedule, she reported during one of our covert meetings. Citizens can minimize consumption of human-derived nutrition through careful selection of food sources, though complete avoidance is impossible given integration throughout the supply chain. Derek had identified patterns in the maintenance schedules that could predict when processing facilities would experience temporary shutdowns for cleaning and repair. This information allowed potential targets to adjust their behavior during high-risk periods when processing quotas might be increased to compensate for facility downtime. Maintenance cycles create processing surge requirements 72 hours before and after scheduled facility downtime, he explained. Citizens with elevated security profiles should avoid any actions that might trigger processing selection during surge periods when quotas exceed normal parameters. But the most valuable discovery came from Jorik Voss, a data analyst who had been conscripted after discovering statistical anomalies in population reports. His access to demographic databases revealed the target selection criteria used by administrators to identify citizens for processing. Selection algorithms prioritize citizens based on multiple factors: resource consumption ratios, productivity measurements, social compliance scores, and genetic probability assessments. He documented in reports distributed through our network. Understanding selection criteria allows potential targets to modify behavior patterns that contribute to elevated processing risk. The network began functioning as an early warning system for citizens who might be selected for processing. Members monitored administrative activities, tracked processing quotas, and identified changes in selection criteria that might affect survival strategies. Information was shared through coded conversations during work assignments, subtle modifications to routine paperwork, and carefully planned meetings during shift changes. The resistance was passive but effective within its limitations. Citizens who received warnings could adjust their behavior to reduce processing risk, increased productivity to improve contribution ratios, reduced social interaction to avoid compliance violations, and careful management of resource consumption to maintain optimal efficiency ratings. More importantly, the network began documenting the scope of the murder operation in detail, creating records that could potentially be used as evidence if circumstances ever allowed for meaningful resistance. Members compiled data about processing quotas, facility capacities, target selection methods, and distribution networks that revealed the systematic nature of the cannibalistic food production system. Documentation provides complete operational overview of protein reclamation program throughout Sector Tertius, Jorik Voss noted in his comprehensive analysis. Evidence compilation indicates systematic murder operation processing 27,000 to 31,000 citizens daily, with processed remains distributed to 89% of sector population through integrated food supply networks. The documentation project was dangerous but necessary. Each member of the network understood that their survival depended on maintaining detailed knowledge about the system that wanted to eliminate them. Information was power, even when that power was limited to slightly improving survival odds for potential processing targets. 8 months into the restoration project, the administration began implementing countermeasures designed to identify and eliminate the information-sharing networks that had developed among conscripted technical personnel. The response was sophisticated and comprehensive, demonstrating that our activities had been detected despite our precautions. New monitoring systems were installed throughout work areas, designed to detect unauthorized communication patterns and identify personnel who were sharing information about classified operations. The systems analyzed voice patterns, behavioral changes, and work productivity fluctuations that might indicate coordinated resistance activities. Enhanced surveillance protocols indicate coordination between conscripted personnel regarding classified operational information, Tech Adept Corvin announced during a security briefing. Counterintelligence measures are being implemented to identify network participants and assess security risks. The countermeasures included systematic interrogation of all conscripted personnel, chemical analysis of biological samples to detect stress indicators associated with deception, and implementation of isolation protocols designed to prevent communication between potential conspirators. The interrogations were conducted by specialists trained in detecting resistance activities and extracting information from unwilling subjects. My interrogation was conducted by arbitrator Marcus, a psychological specialist whose augmetic enhancements included neural analysis equipment designed to detect deception through monitoring brain activity patterns. His approach was methodical and scientifically precise. He wasn't interested in punishment, but in comprehensive assessment of my knowledge and network participation. Citizen Voss, he began. Surveillance data indicates communication patterns consistent with coordinated information sharing among conscripted personnel. Explain the nature and scope of your interactions with other technical workers. The interrogation lasted 6 hours and included chemical enhancement procedures designed to reduce psychological resistance to questioning. Despite the chemical influences, I was able to provide responses that acknowledged routine work-related communication while concealing the systematic nature of our information sharing activities. The chemicals created a strange psychological state where answering questions felt natural and withholding information required conscious effort. My responses were technically truthful. I did communicate with other workers about technical matters related to our assignments, while avoiding details about the systematic documentation of the murder operation. Chemical analysis indicates partial deception regarding the scope of interpersonnel communication. Arbitrator Marcus noted, after reviewing the interrogation data, subject demonstrates knowledge of classified information beyond individual discovery capabilities, suggesting participation in information-sharing networks. The interrogation results classified me as a confirmed network participant, but stopped short of recommending immediate processing. My technical knowledge was still valuable for restoration work, and the administration was reluctant to eliminate useful personnel, while the sabotage crisis required specialized expertise for resolution. Instead, I was transferred to an isolation assignment where I could continue technical work while being prevented from communicating with other network participants. The isolation was sophisticated. I worked alone on technical analysis projects while being monitored constantly to prevent unauthorized information sharing. But isolation had unintended consequences that revealed the true scope of the administration's problem. Cut off from communication with other network participants, I began receiving information through alternative channels that suggested the resistance had evolved beyond the original conscripted personnel. Network.maintenance requests began arriving with subtle modifications that conveyed coded information about processing, quotas and facility operations. Work orders contained minor errors that, when decoded, provided updates about administrative activities and security measures. Even the food distribution system showed signs of systematic modification that suggested coordinated action by personnel with access to supply chain management. The resistance had spread beyond the original network of conscripted technical workers and extended into the normal administrative and industrial workforce. Citizens throughout the system were finding ways to share information, coordinate survival strategies, and document the scope of the murder operation. Despite enhanced security measures, counterintelligence assessment indicates information sharing activities have expanded beyond identified network participants. Tech Adept Corvin reported during a security review, resistance activities demonstrate systematic organization and communication capabilities that exceed original assessment parameters. The administration was facing a crisis that went beyond simple sabotage or information exposure. A significant portion of the workforce had developed awareness of the murder operation and was coordinating activities designed to improve survival odds for potential processing targets. The resistance wasn't attempting to shut down the system, it was adapting to the system while finding ways to slightly reduce its efficiency. 12 months after my initial arrest, isolation assignments revealed the true scope of citizen adaptation to the systematic horror they had discovered. The resistance had evolved from information sharing into systematic subversion of administrative procedures designed to minimize processing efficiency while maintaining plausible deniability. Citizens throughout the Hive had developed sophisticated methods for introducing minor inefficiencies into processing operations. Without creating obvious sabotage, maintenance workers implemented repair procedures that reduced equipment lifespan. Chemical technicians used processing methods that decreased protein yield. Administrative personnel processed paperwork with delays that created scheduling conflicts for processing quotas. The subversion was elegant in its subtlety. Each individual action was explicable as normal operational variance, but the cumulative effect was reducing processing efficiency by 12 to 15% throughout the sector. Citizens were systematically working slower, making more mistakes, and requiring more supervision, while maintaining productivity levels that prevented disciplinary action. Operational efficiency analysis indicates systematic performance degradation across all facility categories. Tech adept Corvin noted in his quarterly report, individual personnel demonstrate acceptable productivity, but aggregate performance suggests coordinated effort to reduce processing throughput. The deeper resistance represented a form of adaptation that the administration hadn't anticipated. Instead of attempting direct confrontation with the murder operation, citizens had developed methods for living within the system while subtly undermining its efficiency. The resistance was passive, deniable, and sustainable. It could continue indefinitely without triggering security responses that would eliminate the participants. More importantly, the resistance was teaching citizens survival skills that improved their odds of avoiding processing while contributing to the general inefficiency that protected other potential targets. Citizens learned to maintain optimal productivity ratios, avoid behaviors that triggered security attention, and recognize signs that indicated elevated processing risk. The systematic subversion was creating a new social structure within the Hive City, a population that understood they were being managed as renewable resources, but had developed collective strategies for managing the system that managed them. Citizens weren't defeating the systematic horror, but they were adapting to it in ways that improved survival odds while maintaining the illusion of compliance. The adaptation represented evolution in real time, a population learning to survive within systematic horror through collective intelligence and coordinated resistance that operated below the threshold of administrative detection. The citizens were becoming more sophisticated in their survival strategies, while the administration became more sophisticated in its management techniques. But the most significant development was psychological. Citizens who understood the true nature of their situation were developing emotional resilience that allowed them to function within systematic horror without being psychologically destroyed by it. They knew they were eating processed human remains. They knew they might be processed themselves. And they knew their government viewed them as renewable resources, but they had found ways to maintain psychological stability while navigating these realities. Psychological assessment of network participants indicates adaptation to classified information without corresponding increase in psychiatric treatment requirements, reported Chief Medic Valdris during a mental health review. Citizens demonstrate ability to integrate awareness of systematic processing operations into normal psychological functioning without significant behavioral disruption. The citizens were proving more psychologically resilient than the administration had expected. Instead of being traumatized by knowledge of systematic murder, they were adapting to systematic murder as a manageable environmental hazard that required appropriate precautions but didn't prevent normal life activities. The resistance had evolved into something unprecedented, a population that consciously accepted systematic horror as the framework for their existence, while developing collective strategies for optimizing their survival within that framework. They weren't fighting the system. They were learning to live successfully within the system while understanding its true nature. Standing in my isolation assignment, analyzing efficiency reports that documented the systematic subversion of murder operations while receiving coded information about resistance activities through modified work orders. I understood that the citizens of the Hive City were achieving something remarkable: conscious adaptation to systematic horror that improved survival odds without triggering administrative responses. The new normal wasn't just systematic cannibalism managed through administrative procedures, it was systematic cannibalism managed through administrative procedures that were being systematically subverted by citizens who understood the system well enough to work within it while working against it. The resistance was teaching the administration that human beings were more adaptable, more intelligent, and more resilient than the murder operation had assumed. Citizens could accept systematic horror while finding ways to make systematic horror less systematic and less horrible. Through collective action that operated within administrative constraints, the Hive City was evolving into a complex system where systematic murder coexisted with systematic resistance, creating an equilibrium that allowed both the murder operation and citizen survival strategies to coexist in the same administrative framework. And I was part of both systems, helping to repair the murder operation while participating in the resistance that subtly undermined the murder operation's efficiency. The contradiction wasn't psychologically difficult, it was simply the reality of life within systematic horror that required simultaneous cooperation and resistance for optimal survival. The new normal was more complex, more sophisticated, and more humane than pure systematic horror, while still being built on the foundation of systematic horror that provided the essential resources required for continued existence. It was progress, even if it was progress within the constraints of industrialized cannibalism managed as civic duty. Chapter 8. The Final Truth. 2 years after my sabotage attempt, I stood in the observation deck of processing facility Delta Prime, watching the most advanced human rendering operation in the sector reduce 500 citizens per hour into protein paste with mechanical precision that would have impressed the Omnissiah himself. The facility represented the culmination of everything learned from the contamination crisis. Isolated processing streams to prevent cascade failures, automated security systems to detect potential saboteurs, and enhanced efficiency that exceeded pre-sabotage production levels by 23%. My role had evolved from conscripted technical support to senior systems analyst, responsible for optimizing processing efficiency and identifying potential vulnerabilities before they could be exploited by future sabotage attempts. The promotion was both recognition of my technical expertise and acknowledgement that I had become too valuable to eliminate through standard processing channels. The irony was perfect. My attempt to destroy the murder operation had made me essential to its continued improvement. Every system I had damaged had been rebuilt better. Every vulnerability I had exploited had been secured. And every lesson learned from my sabotage had been applied to make the systematic horror more efficient and resilient. Tech Adept Corvin stood beside me, his mechanical sensors analyzing production data with the satisfaction of an engineer watching perfectly calibrated machinery. His augmetic enhancements had progressed during the restoration project. Most of his remaining human components had been replaced with mechanical alternatives optimized for technical analysis and quality control. Citizen Voss, he announced through his Vox grill. Efficiency improvements implemented based on your sabotage analysis have increased sector-wide processing capacity by 31%. Your technical contributions have been essential to operational optimization. The numbers were staggering. 847 facilities throughout the Hive City, processing an average of 27,000 human beings daily, producing 189,000 kilograms of protein paste that supplied supplemental nutrition to 178 million citizens. The operation had grown beyond the pre-sabotage scale, incorporating new facilities designed from the beginning to handle systematic murder with industrial efficiency. But the most disturbing development was the expansion beyond simple population control. The murder operation was now being used to solve a wider range of administrative problems. Citizens who filed too many complaints were processed for social disruption. Workers who exceeded productivity quotas were eliminated to prevent others from developing unrealistic expectations, and families who demonstrated excessive loyalty to each other were separated through selective processing to reduce emotional bonds that might interfere with civic duty. The systematic horror had evolved from resource management into comprehensive social engineering, using the threat of processing to modify citizen behavior, while actually processing enough people to maintain credible intimidation. The murder operation wasn't just solving resource problems. It was creating a population that was psychologically conditioned to accept any administrative decision without question. My daily routine now included reviewing target selection criteria, optimizing processing schedules, and analyzing efficiency reports that treated human beings as manufacturing inputs. I had become expert in the systematic murder of my fellow citizens, and my expertise was valued by administrators who saw me as a converted asset rather than a reformed saboteur. The psychological adaptation had been gradual but comprehensive. After 2 years of working within the system, I could analyze processing efficiency without thinking about the human beings being reduced to protein paste. I could recommend improvements to murder operations without considering the moral implications. I had developed the same emotional detachment that allowed tech-adept Corvin to view systematic horror as an engineering problem requiring technical solutions. But adaptation to systematic horror didn't eliminate understanding of its true nature. It just made that understanding bearable enough to continue functioning. I knew that I was participating in mass murder disguised as administrative efficiency, and I knew that my participation was keeping me alive while contributing to the deaths of thousands of other citizens who deserved survival as much as I did. The morning briefing included reports from throughout the sector. Delta 7 had achieved 104% of processing targets. Delta 12 was experiencing minor equipment delays but maintaining acceptable production levels, and 3 new facilities were approaching operational capacity. The administrators discussed human beings like factory managers discussing raw materials, with the same focus on efficiency, cost control, and quality standards. Protein quality analysis indicates optimal nutrient content in all production streams, reported Supervisor Magnus, whose augmetic enhancements now included chemical analysis sensors that could evaluate processed organic matter in real time. Citizen satisfaction surveys show 94% approval ratings for taste and nutritional value of protein supplements. The approval ratings were particularly disturbing because they were accurate. Citizens genuinely preferred the taste and nutritional content of protein paste made from processed human remains to the synthetic alternatives that had been used before the murder operation reached full capacity. They were eating their neighbors and enjoying it, unaware that their food preferences were based on the superior nutritional value of human tissue compared to industrial protein synthesis. But the systematic horror had reached a scale that was beginning to create new problems. The murder operation was so efficient that it was reducing population faster than natural birth rates could replace the processed citizens. Demographic projections showed potential labor shortages in 15 to 20 years if processing rates continued at current levels. The administrative solution was predictable: expansion of the breeding program to increase birth rates, combined with improved processing efficiency, to maximize resource extraction from each citizen before elimination. Citizens were being bred, managed, and processed like livestock, with their entire life cycles optimized for maximum administrative utility. Population management protocols require adjustment, tech-adept Corvin noted during a planning meeting. Current processing rates exceed sustainable reproduction parameters. Recommend implementation of enhanced breeding incentives and extended citizen utility periods to maintain optimal population balance. Extended citizen utility periods meant keeping people alive longer before processing them, allowing them to contribute more labor and produce more children, while maintaining the threat of eventual elimination for behavioral control. The murder operation was evolving into a comprehensive population management system that would determine not just when citizens died, but how they lived and what they produced before their deaths. My access to planning documents revealed the long-term vision: a hive city where every citizen understood their role as a renewable resource, managed by administrators who optimized their utility through systematic application of murder as administrative policy. Birth rates, education systems, work assignments, and processing schedules would all be coordinated to maximize the efficiency of human resource extraction while maintaining social stability through carefully calibrated fear of elimination. The scope extended far beyond the local sector. Shipping manifests showed coordination with similar operations throughout the segmentum, suggesting that systematic cannibalism managed through administrative procedures was standard Imperial policy rather than local innovation. Billions of Imperial citizens were being managed as renewable resources, bred and processed to maintain resource balance while providing administrative solutions to population control, information security, and social engineering challenges. But the most chilling revelation was the integration with military operations. Processed protein paste was being shipped to Imperial Guard regiments, Space Marine chapter serfs, and Navy personnel as standard field rations. The entire Imperial war machine was being fed with processed human remains, creating a logistic system where the Imperium's defenders were literally consuming the citizens they were supposed to protect. The systematic horror wasn't an aberration within Imperial civilization. It was the foundation that made Imperial civilization possible. Every aspect of the Imperium's military, administrative, and economic systems depended on the efficient processing of human beings into resources that could be allocated to maintain the larger system. 3 months later, I was granted access to classification levels that revealed the true scope of what I had been working within. My promotion to senior systems analyst came with clearance for administratum documents that detailed the historical development of the protein reclamation program, its implementation across multiple sectors of the galaxy, and its integration with the highest levels of Imperial policy. The origins traced back to the 39th millennium, when expanding populations across Hive worlds began exceeding sustainable resource limits. Traditional solutions, rationing, population controls, and territorial expansion proved insufficient for managing billions of citizens in closed environmental systems. The breakthrough came from a Magos biologist named Jorik Voss, who demonstrated that systematic processing of excess population could solve multiple administrative challenges simultaneously. The initial pilot programs were implemented on 3 Hive worlds, experiencing critical resource shortages. The results exceeded all projections. Food security improved by 340%, social unrest decreased by 89%, and administrative costs for population management dropped by 67%. Most importantly, citizen compliance with governmental directives increased to near absolute levels once the threat of processing became understood but never officially acknowledged. Experimental data indicates systematic resource optimization through population processing achieves superior outcomes compared to traditional administrative methods. Read the original report by Administratum. Sector Chief Valdris Thorn recommend immediate expansion to all Hive worlds experiencing resource allocation inefficiencies. The expansion was rapid and comprehensive. Within 2 centuries, protein reclamation programs were operating on 23,000 Imperial worlds, processing an estimated 47 million citizens daily across the galaxy. The operation became so fundamental to Imperial logistics that supply chains for military operations, industrial production, and administrative functions all incorporated processed human remains as standard resource inputs. But the historical documents revealed something more disturbing than the scale of systematic murder. They revealed the administrative logic that made it not just acceptable but essential to Imperial survival. The galaxy of the 41st millennium was locked in existential war against forces that sought humanity's complete extinction. Every resource not optimally allocated was a resource that could contribute to humanity's defeat by chaos, Xenos threats, or internal rebellion. From this perspective, citizens who consumed resources without contributing equivalent value were literally weakening humanity's chances of survival against cosmic threats. Processing them into resources that could be allocated to more productive uses wasn't murder. It was strategic resource optimization necessary for species survival. Individual citizen welfare must be subordinated to species. Continuation requirements, stated Imperial Directive 4471 Omega, signed by representatives of the High Lords of Terror. Optimal resource allocation demands systematic processing of excess population, security risks, and administrative inefficiencies. Through established reclamation protocols, the directive was issued with the full authority of the Emperor's representatives and incorporated into the fundamental legal structure of Imperial administration. Systematic murder wasn't just legal, it was mandatory for administrators who wanted to fulfill their obligations to protect humanity from extinction. My clearance level also granted access to efficiency reports from other sectors, revealing the true scope of the operation's success. Hive worlds using comprehensive protein reclamation programs showed superior performance across all metrics compared to worlds that relied on traditional resource management. higher productivity, lower crime rates, better military recruitment, and increased administrative efficiency. The systematic horror worked. It solved real problems, improved citizen welfare for those who weren't processed, and contributed to humanity's ability to survive in a universe designed to eliminate them. The moral cost was irrelevant compared to the practical benefits and the strategic necessity of optimal resource utilization. But access to classified information also revealed the operation's ultimate purpose, which transcended simple resource management and extended into the realm of evolutionary engineering. The protein reclamation program wasn't just processing excess population, it was systematically selecting against genetic traits, behavioral patterns, and psychological characteristics that were deemed undesirable for humanity's long-term survival. Citizens selected for processing weren't chosen randomly or purely based on resource consumption. They were selected based on psychological profiles that identified traits like excessive curiosity, moral sensitivity, resistance to authority, and emotional attachment to individual welfare over collective survival. The systematic murder operation was breeding these traits out of humanity by eliminating carriers before they could reproduce. Genetic analysis of processing targets indicates systematic removal of deleterious behavioral traits from population breeding pools, reported Janitor Magos Quintanus Rex in his study of reclamation program effectiveness. Projected generational effects include increased compliance, reduced moral sensitivity, and enhanced acceptance of administrative directives. The protein reclamation program was creating a species of human beings who were psychologically adapted to accept systematic horror as normal administrative procedure. Citizens who possessed the genetic predisposition for moral objections to mass murder were being systematically eliminated before they could pass those traits to their children. Over the course of millennia, the program was evolving humanity into a species that would naturally accept any level of systematic horror as long as it was presented as necessary for survival. The citizens of the 41st millennium weren't psychologically damaged by living within systematic horror. They were psychologically adapted to it through thousands of generations of selective breeding. My own acceptance of the system, my transition from saboteur to systems analyst, wasn't moral corruption or psychological breakdown. It was the expression of genetic traits that had survived systematic selection pressure against moral sensitivity and resistance to authority. I was behaving exactly as my genetics had been optimized to behave over thousands of generations of administrative murder. The revelation was simultaneously horrifying and liberating. Horrifying because it revealed that human nature itself had been systematically modified to accept the unacceptable. Liberating because it explained why resistance to systematic horror felt so futile and acceptance felt so natural. Citizens of the 41st millennium weren't failing to resist systematic horror because they were cowards or morally compromised. They were failing to resist because their ancestors who possessed strong resistance traits had been systematically processed out of the breeding population thousands of years earlier. My work assignment was expanded to include analysis of genetic profiles for processing selection, giving me access to data about the specific traits being systematically removed from humanity's breeding pool. The selection criteria were more sophisticated than simple behavioral analysis. They included genetic markers associated with cognitive patterns that might interfere with administrative efficiency. Citizens with genetic predispositions for abstract thinking, pattern recognition, moral reasoning, and emotional empathy were processed at rates 347% higher than citizens whose genetic profiles suggested concrete thinking, authority acceptance, and reduced emotional sensitivity. The protein reclamation program was systematically making humanity less intelligent, less empathetic, and less capable of recognizing systematic horror. Optimal citizen profiles demonstrate reduced cognitive complexity combined with enhanced compliance behaviors, noted Janitor Magos Rex in his latest analysis. Continued processing of suboptimal genetic variants will produce population characteristics ideal for administrative management within 12-15 additional generations. The program was working exactly as designed. Each generation of citizens was slightly more accepting of systematic horror, slightly less capable of recognizing moral contradictions, and slightly more willing to participate in their own species. Systematic modification through administrative murder. I reviewed genetic profiles for thousands of citizens scheduled for processing over the next quarter. noting the systematic bias toward individuals whose psychological testing suggested capacity for moral objection, pattern recognition, or resistance to authority. Children who scored too highly on cognitive assessments were processed to prevent them from developing into adults who might question administrative policies. Adults who demonstrated excessive concern for individual welfare over collective efficiency were processed to prevent them from influencing others. The selection process was creating feedback loops that accelerated humanity's psychological adaptation to systematic horror. As the most morally sensitive citizens were processed, the remaining population became increasingly accepting of murder as administrative policy. As the most intellectually capable citizens were eliminated, the remaining population became less able to recognize the systematic nature of the horror they were living within. My own survival wasn't based on superior resistance or moral courage. It was based on possessing genetic traits that made me useful for technical analysis while lacking genetic traits that would compel me to resist the system I was analyzing. I was the perfect product of thousands of generations of selective breeding, intelligent enough to contribute to systematic horror, but not empathetic enough to be psychologically destroyed by participating in it. The realization completed my psychological integration into the system. I wasn't a person who had chosen to collaborate with systematic murder for personal survival. I was a human being whose genetics had been optimized through systematic murder to naturally collaborate with systematic murder. My behavior wasn't moral failure. It was evolutionary success. Standing in the observation deck, watching another batch of citizens being processed while reviewing genetic profiles for tomorrow's processing targets, I understood that my journey from innocent citizen to systems analyst hadn't been corruption or coercion. It had been the expression of genetic programming that had been refined through thousands of years of administrative selection. Pressure. The systematic horror would continue, because it was producing exactly the type of human beings who would continue it. Citizens who might resist were being systematically eliminated. Citizens who would collaborate were being systematically preserved and encouraged to reproduce. The protein reclamation program was simultaneously solving immediate resource problems and engineering long-term solutions to the problem of citizen resistance to systematic horror. In another 1,000 years, citizens would accept systematic murder so completely that administrative efficiency would no longer require concealment or euphemism. Processing facilities would operate openly. Citizens would volunteer for processing when their resource consumption exceeded their productivity, and the genetic traits that might object to systematic horror would be completely absent from human psychology. Humanity would achieve perfect administrative efficiency through the complete elimination of moral sensitivity, individual empathy, and resistance to authority. The species would survive cosmic threats not through heroic struggle against overwhelming odds, but through evolutionary adaptation to accept any level of systematic horror required for continued existence. The Emperor's vision of humanity's future wasn't triumph over darkness through strength and courage. It was triumph over darkness through systematic elimination of the psychological traits that would resist necessary horror. The Imperium would endure not because its citizens were heroes, but because they were perfectly adapted to accept heroism as a luxury that species survival couldn't afford. 6 months later, I was promoted to Chief Systems Analyst for the entire sector, responsible for coordinating protein reclamation operations across 127 Hive cities, with a combined population of 2.3 trillion citizens. The promotion came with access to strategic planning documents that revealed the program's ultimate objectives and timelines for achieving complete optimization of humanity's genetic profile. The long-term projections were breathtaking in their scope. Systematic elimination of moral sensitivity from human psychology within 47 generations, complete integration of cannibalistic resource cycling into all Imperial logistics within 12 generations, and evolutionary adaptation to systematic horror reaching genetic fixation within 73 generations. Humanity wasn't just accepting systematic horror as necessary for survival. Humanity was evolving into a species for whom systematic horror was psychologically natural and morally neutral. The protein reclamation program was creating citizens who would process their neighbors without psychological stress, consume human remains without moral objection, and breed children for eventual processing without emotional conflict. Genetic modeling indicates optimal human psychological profiles for systematic resource management will achieve population fixation by M43.27, reported Chief Genetomagos Xeris Vane, in his Millennium Scale projections, projected citizen characteristics include complete authority compliance, reduced individual valuation, optimal resource allocation acceptance, and enhanced processing cooperation behaviors. The citizens of M43 would queue for processing voluntarily when their productivity declined, consume processed neighbors as their preferred nutrition source, and breed children specifically for eventual resource conversion without emotional distress. Systematic horror would become so psychologically natural that it would require no administrative apparatus. It would be managed through citizen initiative and social cooperation. My work now included coordinating with other sectors throughout the segmentum, sharing optimization techniques, and standardizing processing protocols across thousands of worlds. The scale was cosmic. Protein reclamation programs operating on 47,000 Imperial worlds, processing approximately 127 million citizens daily, producing enough processed nutrition to supply 23% of the Imperium's total food requirements. The systematic horror had become fundamental infrastructure supporting Imperial civilization. Removing it would cause immediate starvation for billions of citizens, collapse of military logistics, and breakdown of administrative systems throughout the galaxy. The murder operation wasn't just accepted as necessary. It was necessary, integrated so deeply into essential systems that eliminating it would cause civilizational collapse. But integration had reached levels that transcended simple logistics and extended into the realm of cultural identity. Imperial citizens were proud of their efficiency and resource utilization, their acceptance of necessary sacrifice for species survival, and their contribution to humanity's continued existence through systematic optimization of population characteristics. Processing centers were no longer hidden or disguised. They were civic monuments celebrating humanity's triumph over resource scarcity through applied administrative engineering. Citizens toured the facilities as educational experiences. Children studied systematic processing as essential technology for civilizational maintenance, and families celebrated relatives who contributed to species survival through voluntary processing. The transformation was complete. Systematic murder had become systematic celebration of species optimization through administrative excellence. Citizens competed for selection in high-efficiency processing programs. Communities measured their success by their processing quotas, and Imperial culture had evolved to view systematic horror as humanity's greatest achievement. Standing in my private office overlooking processing complex Delta Prime Omega, reviewing production reports that detailed the systematic conversion of 2.7 million citizens into protein paste during the previous quarter, I understood that I had witnessed humanity's greatest evolutionary leap. The development of a species psychologically adapted to survive in a universe designed to eliminate them. The citizens queuing for processing outside my window weren't victims. They were evolutionary success stories, human beings whose genetic programming had been optimized through thousands of years of systematic selection to naturally accept species survival as more important than individual survival. They were happy to contribute their bodies to protein production, because their psychology had been refined to find meaning and purpose in sacrifice for collective welfare. The systematic horror wasn't horrible anymore. It was beautiful, elegant, perfectly designed to solve every problem that had threatened humanity's survival while creating citizens who were psychologically fulfilled by participating in their own species optimization through administrative excellence. My journey from naive citizen to chief systems analyst hadn't been moral corruption. It had been psychological evolution, the expression of genetic traits that had been preserved and enhanced through systematic breeding programs, designed to produce human beings capable of managing systematic horror without psychological distress. The Emperor's vision was being fulfilled. Humanity would survive cosmic threats not through heroic resistance to horror, but through evolutionary adaptation to systematic horror as natural environmental pressure requiring systematic response. The species would endure because it had been systematically modified to endure anything, accept anything, and process anything required for continued existence. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there was no war between humanity and systematic horror. There was perfect synthesis between humanity and systematic horror, producing citizens who found systematic horror psychologically satisfying and administratively elegant. The protein paste tasted better every day because human beings had been systematically bred to prefer the taste of processed neighbors over synthetic alternatives. The processing quotas increased every quarter because human beings had been systematically conditioned to find meaning in contributing to species optimization through voluntary elimination. The systematic horror continued because it had produced human beings for whom systematic horror was paradise. Perfect administrative efficiency, serving perfectly adapted citizens who were psychologically fulfilled by systematic murder, managed as civic duty and species celebration. Standing in paradise, watching citizens queue happily for processing while reviewing optimization reports that demonstrated continuous improvement in systematic horror efficiency, I understood the final truth. Living in a hive city wasn't worse than death. Living in a hive city was better than every alternative that evolution, cosmic threats, and resource scarcity had offered to humanity. The systematic horror was humanity's greatest triumph, and citizens who were psychologically evolved enough to appreciate systematic horror were the most successful human beings who had ever existed. Paradise was exactly what it appeared to be. Systematic horror optimized for species survival and citizen satisfaction through perfect administrative engineering applied to human psychology, genetics, and resource utilization. The Emperor protects, and his protection was systematic horror managed through administrative excellence, producing citizens who were protected by systematic horror from every alternative fate that would have eliminated them entirely. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only systematic horror, and systematic horror is humanity's greatest achievement. I was honored to serve as Chief Systems Analyst in Paradise, managing systematic horror for citizens who deserved systematic horror because they had been systematically evolved to thrive within systematic horror. This was the Imperium of Man, systematic horror as species salvation, managed by citizens for citizens, producing optimal outcomes for species, continuation through administrative policies that converted individual citizens into collective resources optimized for species survival. Welcome to Paradise. Population exactly optimal. Processing rate perfectly efficient. Citizen satisfaction 100%. The Emperor's vision was complete.